Lance Hauge.
Thanks for the intro. And thanks everybody for coming. Lots of familiar faces out there, but lots of new ones too. So the presentation is basically going to be trying to explain what that means, what she just said as far as bridging conscious awareness and ego perception. I keep wanting to hide behind that podium, but I guess I'll stay out here. As she said, I've been working in the Twin Cities for a little over 20 years now, and started out doing body work. Rolfing was the modality. Went to Boulder, Colorado, did the training there, then moved to Minneapolis shortly after and started my Rolfing practice. And got into Rolfing because I had a problem with my hip that took me out of running. And so my motivation was to try to run again. I wasn't interested in being a rolfer or getting into alternative healing. I didn't even know what awakening or any of that stuff was about. I just wanted to be able to run again. And but my journey began there. Went to the Rolf Institute straight out of college. Went from living in a fraternity house at Arizona State, which at that time was considered the #1 party school in the nation. To about 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Boulder, Colorado, in a circle, and they were passing a crystal around, and we were supposed to check in about how we were feeling. And it became a running joke that every time the crystal would come to me, I'd say, "I'm fine," and I would hand the crystal on. When they tried to suggest that emotional stuff might have something to do with what's going on in my hip, I was furious. So I had an intense emotional reaction about that and fought it every step of the way. A couple of times, some of the weird people that were there mentioned energy, and I really didn't like what I was hearing. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake moving to Boulder, Colorado and doing this weird culty thing. So the people at the Rolf Institute get a real kick now out of what I do and how far I've come from where I was when they first saw me. So just to give you a little rundown of kind of my personal history, and I'm just going to jump over it kind of quick, and then I'll do a little bit of jumping around between my process and then the process that as far as the healing process that I call dimension therapy, which has been this evolving process over the years as I've learned more, as I've gone through more experiences myself, and as I've done more trainings. So I got into Rolfing, like I said, because my hip hurt. I'm going to go through this cause and effect hierarchy, if you will, where I kept thinking I was getting to the cause of my hip problem, and then I kept finding out that, no, that's actually symptom. There's something else that's the cause of that symptom. So it started out, my hip hurt. Eventually I was told, well, my hip hurts because the head of my femur is being ground down because my joint's not working right, which is the same thing as everyone who eventually needs a hip replacement. But then I found out that the reason my hip wasn't working right is because my right psoas muscle was weak and wasn't providing the core support in my body, and so the hip was compressing. And for each of these, I won't go into it, but for each of these, then I spent hours and hours trying to correct that. So like for that one, I started doing psoas strengthening exercises and core strengthening exercises, and trying to hold myself a certain way when I ran, but it just didn't work. So eventually I found out, well, the reason the psoas is weak is because the L1 nerve that innervates the psoas isn't firing. And so that's the problem. And so I later found out that, well, it's not that the nerve was broken or something. It was that the nerve wasn't firing and getting the signal to the psoas muscle because there was a subluxation in my mid-back. And so the nerve was being pinched off. And so that was finally the cause, the root cause of the problem, I thought. So I went to a chiropractor, and the chiropractor would do an adjustment, And it was a miracle. My psoas muscle would suddenly work. I could feel it. I was able to lift my leg with strength. My body felt more balanced. I thought that I'd finally found the root cause of the problem. But what would happen is, by the time I got to my car, it would be out again. And I could just feel it go, you know? And so after, overall, I saw chiropractors about 3 times a week for about 2 years, and I saw a handful of different ones. And what they kept coming back to is, you know, the adjustment just won't hold. It's too far gone. You just got to kind of give up on athletics. You're looking at a hip replacement at a pretty young age, and that's that. Which was devastating at the time. My ego identity was primarily wrapped up in being a good runner, so I was suffering that. And went to college, was willing to try anything, saw in a magazine something about Rolfing, went and tried that. The Rolfer agreed with that sequence as far as cause and effect, but the Rolfer said the reason that that your spine won't hold the adjustment is because the fascial tissue's out of balance. And if we just get the fascial tissue balanced, then the adjustment will hold, then the nerve will fire, et cetera, et cetera. So great, I did the 10 sessions of Rolfing, got excited enough about it to go out to the Rolf Institute and do the training. And as with all the other modalities, it seemed like maybe it was gonna help and there was hope, but then ultimately it was just frustrating. It just wouldn't really last. So, like I said before, moved from Colorado here to Minneapolis, started my Rolfing practice, and started getting exposed to the idea of subtle energy fields and chakras, and started learning that the fascial tissue and the muscles and everything else really is doing what the subtle energy is having it do. And so it's blockages and imbalances in my subtle energy field that's the cause level of my problem. So great, started seeing energy healers, started reading about chakras, started doing everything I could to try to get my energy field balanced or cleared or whatever it was that was supposed to happen in my energy field so that I could run again. So several years of that, and eventually started learning that it's actually deep traumas in my psyche from childhood or even from past lives that are really the cause level of what's going on in my mind that's causing my subtle energy field to imbalance my fascia, etc. So it's like, all right, let's do that. What do I got to do then to resolve that? Because I want to run again. So let me clear these past life traumas. So kind of coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, around the time that I was really getting into depth psychology and trauma work and past life work and trying to get deeper into my psyche and deconstruct whatever it was I needed to deconstruct, I went through some traumatic experiences that really facilitated this deconstruction that I was trying to do in my ego mind. I went through a divorce was probably the primary event, and the things surrounding that, my ego identity and where I was orienting from, the ego energetic structure in my psyche that I was orienting from. And I'm going to get into the theory of that a little bit, but the idea that we have these ego structures in our minds that we orient from and consider to be self. And when life throws experience at us that challenges it too much, it destabilizes it, right? And we are thrown into crisis, and if it's severe enough, we get thrown into psychosis, and people tend to have, sorry, this thing keeps catching on my collar. We tend to have altered states of experience. And then there's that whole idea of to what extent is it simply pathology and psychosis, and to what extent is it spiritual emergency? To what extent is it real? To what extent is it all just fantasy? So I went through about a 5-year period of being in the throes of this, and I still was able to go to work, still worked with clients while I was quite psychotic. But I was able. No, not quite yet. I'm still in this process. But so I was able to function for the most part, but at the same time, and I think a lot of people can probably relate to this, underneath my healthy functioning that I was doing, I felt like I was hanging by a thread and was in survival mode and didn't know if I was going to kill myself that night or if I was going to lose my sanity completely. If I was going to disappear. I was all over the map. I was seeing more and more stuff, seeing dimensions, seeing the energy field more clearly, seeing, going into states of just hopeless despair, coming out of those states, going into states of bliss and love. And through the process, I would study like crazy, trying to get a mental framework for what is going on here. And eventually, there were some key events through there where it was kind of turning points where I stabilized, and I started becoming aware of awareness, becoming aware of my conscious self. I started discerning between when I was stuck in an ego state and when I would come out of it and get relief from it. And so that process is continuing. I continue to go into ego states and come back out, just like everyone does. But more and more, I've gotten a sense of that experience where I'm aware of myself as awareness. What some people would call the soul, some people would call it your essential self, your inner self, your real self. I'm kind of categorizing those all as this idea of coming out of the ego, psyche, chakra, body experience into that orientation where you're just aware of all that stuff, but you're not aware as it. You're aware as some other thing. So one of the main, there's a handful of kind of points I want to make about this stuff. None of it's new points. It's stuff that's out there, but I feel like there's certain stuff that that took me 20 years of reading and trying to synthesize to finally arrive at a certain insight about it. And then I always felt like, well, why didn't they just say that in the beginning, in these books that I read? But I think that's kind of the way it works, right? Is we have our own filters, and if it was just said the right way, we'd have gotten it a long time ago, which isn't really true, probably. But so this idea of awareness as awareness, or the conscious self, just the simple model of consciousness that I use is how I organize it in my mind and how I teach it. That the truth is we are awareness, we are a soul, we are this essential self that is an actual thing that has certain capacities and abilities as far as awareness. And then there's the ego mind, which doesn't have the same capacities that the conscious self does. The ego mind does not, the way I'm using the term, and again, these terms get used in so many different ways, so I'm going to try to do some defining of how I'm using some of these terms. The ego mind doesn't have its own ontological beingness. The idea is that the ego mind is an apparatus of the self with capital S, or soul, or conscious awareness that is the ontological being self. The ego is capable of perception, but a certain kind of perception. Time-oriented, projective, referencing perception, which is different than how the conscious mind works. So the idea is we have these bodies, we have these energy fields, that are the instruments through which we experience life. And that experience, just like in the nervous system, how all the sensory nerves make their way to the spine and up into the brain, the subtle energy field works the same way. There's all this subtle energy experience that works its way through the chakras, for example, into the core and up into the mind. And ideally, the ego mind faces the experience, organizes it, processes it, and lets that experience, and I'm using the energy model. So if you say all experience is really vibratory energy experience, it lets those vibrations then move through the ego mind back into the conscious self. And to the extent that that happens, we have processed, we've faced, we've come to an acceptance of the experience that we went through. But as we all know, our ego minds hit certain experience that we don't face, we don't come to terms with, we don't know how to resolve, experience that we're told is taboo, or that we're not supposed to have. And so instead of staying oriented as our conscious selves and allowing experience to move through the mind and letting our conscious selves discern what should we do in response to this, how should we categorize this experience, instead our ego minds clamp down in an effort to block or repress that experience. And when that happens, then we get in trouble. Then stuff starts to be unresolved. We start to develop these defensive patterns in our minds, in our energy fields, in our bodies. And if it's severe enough, if the experience we're going through is scary enough or threatening enough, or if we have an intense enough judgment about it, and we can't seem to be blocking it out, we're confronted by it too much, the last line of defense is that we will close down our minds and separate our ego mind out from conscious awareness. And that way, we just sort of get rid of it. It's as if we're trying to make it not exist. So splitting is the term that gets used in psychotherapy, and the idea is we split off conscious awareness from ego perception. So just like a circuit breaker in an electrical circuit breaker in a house, if the system gets overwhelmed, for example, the house gets struck by lightning, there's a circuit breaker that's going to throw the switch because it's protecting the system from getting too overwhelmed, right? So the switch gets thrown, and for example, the lamp goes out. And we all know that you can change the light bulb, you can take the lamp apart, you can, do what we all do is turn the switch on and off 1,000 times to see if maybe the light will come back on. But at some point, you gotta go turn the switch back on the circuit breaker, or the lamp is just not gonna work. The cause of the problem is at a different level than at the light bulb or in the wires in the lamp, etc. So, making the analogy, obviously, that throwing the switch at the circuit breaker is splitting in the psyche. And the splitting, as far as in the consciousness system, the splitting is between conscious awareness and the ego mind. So now we have them separated. So as far as how we experience that, we go forward kind of jumping the split. So at a certain point in time, we will be separated out from our conscious awareness, and we'll just be reacting to that portion or that part of our psyche. And when that's the case, we'll tend to be pretty defensive, we'll get triggered easily, because we're in that state, we're not grounded in, we've lost touch with our conscious awareness. And so innately there's this fear orientation that happens. Then when we're not triggered and we jump the split and now we're aware of our conscious awareness, we feel better, but now we're separated out from that portion of our psyche that's split off from that. So I'm suggesting that we all have this going on to varying degrees, that we have certain portions of our brain, certain portions of our nervous system, certain portions of our emotional self, certain portions of our mental self that are split off from our conscious awareness. And moment to moment, we're jumping back and forth. We're trying to remain consciously aware, but depending on what's going on, these split off places are constantly getting triggered, or vibrations are making them try to get active, and then we, in simple terms, we defend against having those places that we had split off show up in our awareness. So, if you take that as a model of how consciousness works, which again isn't my model, I feel like most of what I've said is fairly universally accepted. Most spiritual systems, most meditative systems, most healing systems generally have that idea. I'm just putting it in kind of simple westernized language. So, as I said earlier, I went through some experiences where I found myself being in touch as that awareness, and really started to see or become aware of chakras, become aware of my ego mind, meaning the energetics of it, and I started noticing it in other people. So in working with myself or working with clients, I started noticing that, okay, as they're laying there on the table and they broke their lower leg when they were 5 years old, and now they're 55 years old and they've got chronic shoulder pain. And I'm seeing that while the shoulder pain is really compensation for what's going on in their leg, and they're saying, no, well, my leg's fine. It was when I was 5 years old. That has nothing to do with what's going on in my shoulder. The Rolfing paradigm is the Rolfer understands that, no, actually what's going on in your leg might have affected your shoulder. But instead of just Rolfing the leg, what I would notice is that when I would just come from that conscious perspective and just be consciously aware of their leg, of the tissue, of the energetic stuff going on, I would start to see that not only was the tissue still contracted and kind of in a defense as though the leg break was happening now, but there was a pattern that went up to the mind, and there was a splitting in the mind away from certain aspects of that leg. And so, sort of to the normal ego eye, the person's just laying on the table seeming to be relaxed. But when you look with conscious perception, you can see these subtle energetic patterns, and I would sort of see this going on. And so, at first I would see that, and then of course I'd just Rolf harder, or think, I need to go up and do craniosacral in the mind to get it to let go, or I just need to do some psychotherapy and tell them, what it is they're doing, and really they're just being defensive, and they just really need to let go of that, which wasn't very effective. I kept noticing over time that every time if I would just back off and allow my conscious perception to be aware of the pattern would start changing. The person would start calming down, the energy would start flowing, and I'd see their mind start to relax. I started to perceive the split between their conscious awareness and this trauma in all its different layers would start to come together. And as their conscious awareness got in touch with the pattern again, their conscious awareness would start unraveling their pattern, while I just really felt like a passive observer watching this happen. And so the results got more profound in the work that I was doing. So it became a practice. It became it's like my practice became trying to keep backing off, and not go in and try to do more. And of course, I obsessively worked on myself in this same way, trying to, get change to happen. And so that was the basis for the work I do now, is that methodology evolved, which was to orient from conscious awareness and then just be aware of whatever it was that showed up, and allow myself to get more and more directly and acutely in touch with what is going on in this person's mind, what's going on in their subtle energy field, what's going on in their body, and if nothing else, just sit and be aware of it. Now, it sounds easy, but one of the things that happens is that the way the conscious self works is to be consciously aware of is also to empathize. The conscious mind feels what it sees. So you can't be consciously aware of without being affected by. So it's one thing to sit and be consciously aware of something that is a vibratory frequency that's not bothersome to you and that your system can easily tolerate. But when you encounter a vibratory frequency, whether it's intense physical pain, whether it's hopeless despair, whether it's vicious hatred, it gets harder then to sit and hold space. The energetic vibration hits your patterns and makes you want to close down in response. So just a little bit about the conscious mind and its capacities. I just said the conscious mind empathizes. The nature of the conscious mind, conscious self, essential self, etc., is that it's non-judgmental, compassionate awareness, right? And again, that's most systems out there say that. Mindful awareness goes into detail as far as the qualities of that kind of perception. So when I say conscious awareness, I'm also saying mindful awareness. And so the idea is that the conscious self is innately compassionate, non-judgmental, and accepting. And the ego mind is not. The ego mind is conditional. So to hold space, to be present with, to be consciously aware of, is to be compassionate and accepting of whatever it is that's going on. And the important distinction there is that to be compassionate and accepting is not to say that it's good. It's not to say you agree with it. It's not to say that you condone the behavior that goes with it. It's simply to say that rather than my ego mind contracting and saying that shouldn't exist, it's accepting that it does exist, and it's allowing the conscious self to hold it. And from there to make decisions about behavior, about viewpoint, etc. So that sounds real easy, but I feel like we're all stuck in that. And as much as I think about it and talk about it and teach it every day, I struggle with it, right? I notice my ego mind wanting to clamp down on stuff that is threatening to me, and open up to stuff that feels like it's in alignment with what I want or how I see the world. So it becomes this practice where you start being able to discern, am I being consciously aware or am I coming from ego? And the idea is if you're suffering, if you're judging, if you're feeling triggered, if you're wrestling with defensive patterns in yourself, you're probably not in a state of total consciousness. So, let's see, as far as a experiential, I'm just noticing the energy in the room shifting. One of the things that happens, and you may notice, I know this is a fairly energetically sensitive crowd. So I see you all kind of, playing with stuff as I'm talking. Instead of listening to what I'm saying, you're... Okay, good. And so, as I'm up here standing in front of you, feeling somewhat nervous, obviously there's a tendency for me to go more towards ego mind and contract. But as this goes on longer and I get more comfortable and as a rapport is building here and as people are kind of playing with awareness, some of you that are more sensitive might notice that the energy in the room is different right now than when we started. And there's starting to be an expansive awareness that's happening. So again, what I do for work, what I do in my personal practice, and what I do and what I teach is really that shift. It's getting to where you can start to discern, when am I coming from non-localized, present moment, compassionate, conscious awareness, versus when am I, or to what degree, am I losing touch with that and orienting from my ego mind? And noticing that if you start from there and look at whether it's your chronic knee problem or your depression, or if you're working with someone else, their maladies that they're dealing with, if you start from that orientation and then just start noticing what shows up, and then you start noticing what's hard to stay conscious with. You start to notice the vibration. You start to notice the irritation in yourself. You start to notice the pull, the contracting pull to get defensive, to argue, to deny. And what you'll notice, and this is what I noticed, as I said, working with clients, is that you start to notice in the other person what the other person is not holding conscious space for. Let me just back up and define a term real quick. The theme this month is managing energy, right? The speaker theme. And if I had to, in just a few words, answer the question, how do you manage energy? I would say you hold space for it. That's how you most effectively manage energy. You consciously hold space for that energy. The idea here is that the conscious self can hold any energy. It doesn't matter if that energy is good or bad, or happy or sad, or you agree with it or not. The idea is that the conscious self has the ability, it has the capacity to hold it. That the conscious self can't really be overcome or overtaken or squashed out by any ego energy. No matter how tragic, how painful, how devastating, the conscious self has the capacity to hold space, hold conscious space for that energy. And it not only is just conscious of it, there's capacities that the conscious mind has to contain that energy, to channel that energy, to transform that energy, that the ego mind simply doesn't have. The ego mind does not have the capacities that the conscious mind does. The ego mind can block it out. The ego mind can attack it. The ego mind can distort it. The ego mind can project it. The ego mind has all its things it can do to manage energy. But the conscious mind manages energy by holding conscious space for it. So, when you consciously hold space for an experience that you notice the other person is not holding conscious space for, something starts to happen. They start being affected by it. And as you sit and hold conscious space for what they're not holding conscious space for, their conscious awareness starts coming in. It starts showing up. The split between their conscious awareness and the stuff that they weren't holding space for starts coming together. And they start to hold conscious space in themselves for what they previously weren't holding space for, in response to you doing it. And how that works, how they change, which thought processes change, how their emotions change, what goes on as far as how their body's nervous system is firing, and the tension and the different muscles. Their conscious self is deciding all that. I'm not deciding what should go where or how they should feel or what paradigms they should live by. I'm simply helping their conscious attention get back in touch with places in themselves that it wasn't, and then they start making all the changes. And to a certain extent, they may be conscious of that or not. They may understand what it was they were doing and now start to do it different, or it may just happen. It's a extremely complex system as far as our bodies and our emotional selves and our energy fields. So different people kind of track different parts of it and notice different things. So, as I'm up here talking about all this and talking about this idea that there's this conscious mind and this ego mind, the ego mind's reaction to all that is to decide whether or not it agrees with those concepts, and if it agrees with those concepts or can tolerate those concepts, then the ego mind says, oh yeah, I get it, I got it, yep, I know how to do that. And the truth is, no you don't. The ego mind doesn't. It's the conscious self that does it. And so, it sounds funny, but this idea that there's a conscious self and that it's different than the ego self, it is a real thing, right? It's a thing. And again, this crowd, I'm preaching to the choir on it, I think, because this crowd, I'm guessing for the most part, has already bought into that it's a real thing, that the energy field, the spiritual self, all that is a real thing. But just to do an experiential for a minute, I've been shifting in and out of this the whole time I've been up here, but I'm gonna just close down in my mind and block a certain kind of awareness and become less present and more ego-oriented. And as I do, I think you'll notice the shift, and then I'll come out of it, and then I'll go the other direction, and then we'll do a group thing for a minute. So I'm just gonna start doing a state shift, and again, all I'm doing is I'm just starting to block awareness in a certain way, and what I'm changing is my orientation as far as what is self. Okay, so I shifted states right there, and now what I'm doing is I'm orienting mostly from my rational mind. And most people would call it, in psychology, to be a fairly narcissistic state. And while I'm looking out at you and talking towards you, the majority of my attention is on me and it's on my mind. And you may notice that if I was in this state the whole time I was up here, you'd probably be pretty annoyed by now. Because I'm not being very present with you, I'm not interacting with the crowd, I'm acting as though I am, but really I'm interacting with my own mind. And in a certain way, that to my ego self, there's a way that it even feels better, right? Because now the feedback loop's all in here, and I'm not having to be dependent on any of you. And so, if I think I'm pretty cool up here, it's all good. Although, if I start getting the idea that oh shit, I'm not doing good up here, then it's going to be really bad. And even if people are looking at me supportively and approvingly, it won't matter because none of that's getting in. I'm just looping up in here. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm just letting go of that contraction. And just an important note, you may have noticed that as I shifted states, you were affected by it, to the extent that you weren't just already simply in your own closed loop, in your own mind. But to the extent that there was a relational field happening, when I did that, you felt it. Okay, so I've let go of that contraction, and now I'm opening back up to the group. I'm aware of space that wasn't there a couple minutes ago. I'm feeling my heart start to slow down again, feeling my breathing normalize. Just that act of contracting, just my system, I just felt it start to go into more and more of a reactive state. And now the opposite is happening. I'm relaxing, and I'm feeling less nervous. I feel more of a creative flow as far, instead of, oh my God, what am I going to say next? I feel more like, it'll come, and, if it doesn't, whatever, I'll get laughed at, and it'll be all right. So again, I'm suggesting that we're fluctuating in and out of these states all the time, and what I just did, isn't some special thing. We're all masters at doing it, right? And this is one of the other points I want to make, is that this idea of being in touch with conscious awareness and discerning, when am I coming from conscious awareness and when am I not? You don't have to become totally enlightened. You don't have to completely transcend the ego or be at some state of universal consciousness to start noticing awareness as awareness, to start noticing the shift and noticing that you can be aware of both at the same time. You can be aware of what your ego experience is and simultaneously be aware of conscious awareness. So instead of modalities that are just about going out into awareness, or modalities that are just about enhancing ego function, the idea here is that both can happen simultaneously. That ego and soul, or ego and spirit, aren't opposed to each other. Soul is innately, compassionately accepting of ego experience, and that when we do that for ourselves, or when we do that for others, it has this positive effect. And again, that to be consciously aware, to hold conscious space for something, doesn't mean you agree with it. It doesn't mean you think it's good, and an important thing is, it doesn't perpetuate it. It's like the ego mind thinks that, well, if I open up and hold space for this person's expression of their political ideology, if I let my ego mind open out and let my conscious self hold it, then I might start to believe them. I might start to think the way they do, or their ideology may get out there and take over the world if I don't react to it and close my mind down to it. And it just doesn't work that way. It's the opposite. The more you open out and allow and hold space for, the less that those particular vibrations have the ability to overcome us. So again, the concept's easy to understand, but the actual practice of that is not, obviously.
Well, what you're saying is you just have to accept Trump.
Right. Which sounds crazy, right? But to accept, I thought you said trauma. You said Trump. That's right. Ideally, yep. Yeah. But basically, yes. As difficult as that may be for some people, to do that. What's that?
That's traumatic.
Yep. It can be. So just the last thing is, well, let me shift real quick as far as a group thing. I know we're hitting the end of our time. As I said, I see people playing with their awareness, but I'm guessing, again, I keep making these assumptions about this crowd, and I'm going to do it again, which I apologize for whatever stereotyping I'm doing. But so I'm guessing largely this is a liberal crowd. Or maybe let me just say it this way. So for those of you that are against Trump, just really think about Trump right now. Really get into how you feel and think about Trump. And for those of you that have a problem with Hillary or with Bernie or whoever else, just really allow yourself to sink into that and notice that you have a perspective, right? You have a certain belief system, you have an orientation, and that orientation you feel like it should be defended. Right? You're coming from a place where you want to be right, you want to be good, you want to fight the good cause, and so there are things to be against in the world and things to be for. And so there's an orientation gets set up where you take a position. And again, I'm not suggesting one stops doing that. But again, for those of you that are pretty energetically sensitive, notice that the energy in the room shifted. That the thing I did a minute ago where I was contracting in my mind, and then there was a certain energy shift, what I'm noticing is now I'm noticing that happening to a certain degree in the room and in the crowd. That essential conscious space, that conscious connection, that present moment awareness has diminished, and there's more of a experience of tension in the room. People looking around, seeing who's for who. Anybody else feel like that's accurate? That the room shifted?
Could I put it right?
Yeah.
Before I felt we were all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're all separate.
Yeah. Yeah. So, again, instead of trying to, talk about, well, who should really be president or what, what should people really think or whatever, notice in addition to your political perspective and the position that you're taking, notice that, again, in addition to, not instead of, if you just consciously intend to find your conscious awareness, non-localized, present moment, conscious self, and notice that it exists beyond that perspective you're taking. And when you show up there, it doesn't unravel your political perspective. It doesn't open the door for the opposing perspective to come in and get you. And you may notice it's not easy. It's harder right now than it was earlier, about 20 minutes ago when I was saying notice the shifting. It's harder. And you may notice emotion, right? Anger is a common one, right, when we're talking about politics. Or it may be weird, you may notice grief. You may notice, that you start noticing that, memories of when your parents never let you have a voice, or times when you got, criticized for your view. And again, the idea is the more you can just show up and be conscious and tolerate that emotion, tolerate the conflict in the mind, tolerate the tension in the body, but stay consciously present with it, you'll notice that there starts to be something happening in the mind. There starts to be some kind of reorganization, some kind of integrating that starts happening.
If you find yourself in the ego mind, how do you bring yourself back to the conscious mind? Is there a technique or?
Yeah, okay.
How do you do that?
Good question. So I'll close with that as we're all trying to get conscious again after bringing up politics. So the answer to that is you come see me for dimension therapy, and or you take my training course. But I'll say this: what I do and what I teach in the training course is available in a lot of other places also. What I said just a minute ago, which was conscious intention. If you just stop for a minute and say, okay, I'm going to find my conscious self. What happens is you get better and better at just going to it. It starts to become something that you can find. But the specific work that I do that I'm calling dimension therapy, it's specifically oriented towards how do you help someone find it when they can't find it. And or how do you find it in yourself? So this idea of holding space. When it's another person, you consciously hold space and you just wait. And you hold space and you hold space and you just let them not hold space and you be present. And it eventually happens. You start noticing that it's having a profound effect, even if they don't know it. And that eventually their conscious awareness is going to reconnect and there's going to be change. When you're working on yourself, the nature of it is that your own blind spots, your own splits are what have you captive, right? So obviously the nature of this model that I'm presenting, you can't just go out and then look back where you actually have a split. So there's two different things you can do. One is you can have someone else hold space for what you're not holding space for. And by the way, we're all attempting to do that all the time, right? In any given moment, you get two people together, and if they have 30 seconds to talk, you start talking about what it is you're struggling to hold space with. You're talking about what's unresolved, what's causing tension. And you're basically saying, will you help me hold this, right? Whether it's what you're angry about or what you're sad about or something you're confused about, that's what we interact about. We don't sit around for very long agreeing on stuff that we both can easily consciously hold, right? It gets boring pretty quick. And we start going towards, now it's a practice to actually do that, to sit, because what you'll notice is you start becoming more consciously present, but the ego resists that and wants to talk about what it's conflicted about. So to allow someone else to hold conscious space for that which you're struggling to hold space for, or when you're working with yourself, to notice the split, to notice that there is a split, and just to briefly try to explain that, you notice what it is you're suffering, right? Whatever it is you're sitting there suffering with. And then when you try to be consciously aware but can't seem to find it, what you will notice is emptiness. You'll notice silence. You'll notice a void. You'll notice nothingness. And that nothingness is the space between the two split off areas, conscious awareness and the ego self. So when you notice the void open up, when you notice silence, when you notice that gnawing, awful nothingness, you can start to know that's that space between me and my conscious self right now. And the idea is, can you stay there? Can you tolerate it? Can you stay in touch with it? Because every second you stay in touch with that, meaning you let your conscious attention be aware of it, you're bringing conscious attention into that void, which is going to be the bridge back to the ego self and the reconnection. So that would be my answer on how you get there. Okay, so we're out of time, and as far as questions, there's no time for questions today, but I'm doing a talk on the 16th. Is it the 16th? That is going to be largely a question and answer session at my office. So for questions people have about the work I do, you can come to that. Otherwise, thanks for hearing me talk.